In the early years, Rose was the vivid, immediate presence in their lives. A friend detected her all-pervasive influence even in the inflection of their voices. When Jack spoke, I could hear his mother's voice. Said this friend simply, "She's the one who put the family's spirit in them." In her son Jack's eyes, Rose was the glue that held the Kennedys together. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess, and if you're new, then welcome to my channel. I hope to earn your subscription today. We are doing the Saturday evening post from October 10th, 1964. Now this would have been less than a year from JFK's assassination. And of course, the whole world was focused on all things Kennedy related. And I came across this article and I'm so excited to share it with you. I hope you'll find it as fascinating as I do. I have not read it yet. Whenever I come to articles like this, I find them in antique and estate sales, and I do not read them in advance. I thought I could do all of this in one episode, but as I look at the length of this article, we're going to do it in 2 and possibly 3 episodes. So the first portion will be the founding of their family and getting the children from Joe, Jack, who's John F. Kennedy, and Rosemary Kennedy. And then we'll get into more child rearing in the second and potentially third episodes. So that's what we're going to do in today's episode. But this one is called Joseph P. Kennedy, A Profile in Power. And of course you see his picture there with his son, John or Jack Kennedy. This is a picture of him with all 4 of his sons. So you have Joseph Kennedy here in the center, the dad, and then this is Joe Jr. You have Jack or John Fitzgerald Kennedy here. This is Robert Francis Kennedy. I believe his middle name is Francis. Robert F. Kennedy there when he was younger. So in this picture you can really see the age difference between John and Robert. And then down here we have Teddy Kennedy, which is just hilarious, honestly, to me. There's Ted Kennedy. Well, this says, for Joe Kennedy, coming in second was just no good. The only important thing was to win. This photo, we're told, is actually the morning after the election, November 9th, 1960. Proud Joe poses with weary President-elect. He does look weary. My goodness, he looks so old compared to his joyful, sparkly self. So that's him the day after the election. This is written by Richard Whalen. Wealth, power, and the chance of greatness for his name have been the lifelong ambitions of Joseph Patrick Kennedy. The first 2 goals he achieved to an awesome degree. The last, which came fleetingly within his grasp, eluded him. So yes, he wanted the presidency. It eluded him. But the sons he reared, enjoying advantages he provided, retrieved it. In a way that went deeper than ordinary parental pride, their success was his. From the beginning, Joe knew what he wanted, money and status for his family, said one who knew him intimately. He had the progenitor's sense. What he did with his children always in mind. Himself the son of a determined man in whom the progenitor's sense was strong, Joe Kennedy stood between what the Kennedys had been and what they could become. He bore the indelible imprint of the time and place of his birth and of the circumstances in which the Kennedys had started their climb in America. His grandfather, Patrick Kennedy, was a tenant farmer who immigrated from destitute Ireland during the Great Potato Famine of the mid-19th century. In October 1848, Patrick Kennedy left the thatch-roofed cottage where he had been born and followed the dirt track down to the seaport of New Ross. There he paid the equivalent of about $20 and took steerage passage aboard a packet ship bound for Boston. On the voyage to the New World, requiring 6 weeks or longer, the Irish suffered a subhuman existence, almost equaling in horror the dread Middle Passage of the African slave trade. Indeed, the Negro, as valuable property, sometimes fared better than the Irishman, who was looked upon as worthless chaff. Patrick Kennedy survived the hard crossing and stepped ashore on Noddle's Island in East Boston. Like many of the new arrivals, he squeezed into one of the cheap boarding houses huddled near the docks. He found work as a cooper, a thriving trade because most of the barrels held whiskey, and saloons multiplied with the influx of Irish. Soon he met Bridget Murphy, an immigrant girl 2 years older than himself, and they were married. On January 8, 1858, a son was born and christened Patrick Joseph. Worn out at 35, Patrick Kennedy succumbed to cholera less than a year after his son was born. He died as poor as when he landed. Young Patrick left school in his early teens and went to work on East Boston's busy waterfront. Fair-skinned, blue-eyed, and well-muscled, PJ, as his friends called him, rebelled at slipping into his father's life of aimless drudgery. His urge to get ahead was practically his only resource. Well, that was a lot of people's story in America. The Yankee-dominated commerce of Boston had no place for a poor Irish youth with little education. Newspaper advertisements often specified that only Native Americans and Protestants need apply. That's an interesting use of the word Native Americans, meaning no Irishmen, I suppose. Patrick Kennedy's opportunity to rise could only come from within the immigrant community. He learned of a saloon for sale in East Boston's Haymarket Square and took it over on a shoestring. As the years passed, he expanded into retail and wholesale whiskey distribution. Different Irishmen would come in, and his circle of acquaintances grew, and they flocked into the Democratic Party, with Patrick Kennedy leading the way. He strengthened his grip on the precincts of East Boston by running a pocket-sized welfare state. The Irish, suspicious of the charity of outsiders, expected and honored help from their own kind. Winning a large and loyal following, Kennedy was elected to office by landslide majorities, first to the Massachusetts House of Representatives, then to the state Senate. But he disliked campaigning and had no appetite for office holding. He saw that there was only one issue at stake in politics: who shall get what? His concern was with the substance of power. He became a member of the Democratic machine's inner circle and met with local bosses to dole out jobs and favors. With the fortunes of many improving, the Irish were inspired to invent such classifications for themselves as shanty for the luckless, lace curtain for the up-and-coming. Patrick Kennedy had been courting a pretty Mary Hickey, but Kennedy, a state representative at 28, clearly had only begun to climb. They were married in 1887 and lived in a modest frame house where their first child was born. He was named Joseph Patrick. So that is who we are focused on now. Joe was the first of 4 children born to the Kennedys. Another son died in infancy, and there were 2 daughters, so he's the only son. By the depressed standard of East Boston, the Kennedys were affluent, but the absence of nagging concern with money in the midst of poverty only served to underscore for a perceptive youngster the usefulness of money, the lever by which a man could lift himself and his family. Patrick Kennedy prospered in steady, unspectacular fashion, investing the profits of saloon keeping and whiskey selling into a coal company and a pair of neighborhood banks that he helped organize. He also invested in a small way in real estate and took an occasional speculative flyer in the stock of mining companies. The Kennedys soon moved up the hill to a 4-story house on Webster Street overlooking the harbor. Through his boyhood, Joe had before him the example of a determined man's ability to take the world as he found it and turn it to his own ends. His boyhood in the quiet backwater of East Boston was untroubled and uneventful. He came through a bout of diphtheria and grew tall and solidly muscled with a temper to match his red hair. So it's funny to think about because we see black and white, and we often see him like this with almost no hair left. Here he has hair, but none of us can imagine the color, but it's a reddish color, at least it was when he was younger. Most of his friends came from poor families, and the pennies they could earn from odd jobs were needed at home. Patrick Kennedy watched with satisfaction as his son joined in the money-making scramble, not only out of necessity, but out of a desire to excel. Joe sold newspapers, worked in a haberdasher's, ran errands at the bank, and even pocketed a few cents for lighting stoves and gas lights in the homes of Orthodox Jews on Sabbath and holy days. So yeah, since Jews can't work in any way on those days, he would partner with them on those days. That's interesting. The measure of a man's success in life, Joe Kennedy once remarked, is not the money he's made. It's the kind of family he has raised. In that, I've been mighty lucky. Luck had little to do with his success as a parent, which commanded the respect and admiration of even his bitter enemies. A decisive influence probably was the example of his own father. Pat Kennedy, like every good parent, showed keen interest in his son's development. Joe sensed his father's support and involvement in everything he did. Life, he came to understand, was a joint venture between one generation and the next. Interesting. Just as he moved his family away from the mud flats to the fine house on Webster Street, so Patrick Kennedy decided early to set his son apart from the run of fellow Irishmen. Joe was taken from parochial school and deliberately thrown into the company of the Protestants of the West Side and the Back Bay. He was enrolled at Boston Latin School, where the sons of New England's leading families had been educated since 1635. Boston Latin offered an avenue to acceptance, and the boy knew he was expected to compete for a place in the society that had been closed to his father. However, he did poorly in his studies except for math, and was forced to remain behind at Boston Latin for a year after his original class graduated. Well, that would have been humbling, wouldn't it? But it was no small accomplishment, as Kennedy saw it later, to stay in this vast intellectual company at all. Here we have more photos that I'm going to share with you. So we have this family photo that shows all 9 children. Let me see if I can do it from this side. It says from left, Patricia. So this is Patricia. Kathleen is there. So that's Kick Kennedy. Rose is his wife. We have Rosemary up here. Now she is the one who had the surgery and was institutionalized. And then we have Jean is the youngest. She is the one who was between Ted and Robert in age. She married Stephen Smith later, and he's come up in some of our stories. And then Eunice Kennedy. So those are the 9 Kennedy children and their parents, all in one photo. Here is another family gathering later that includes some of the spouses like Jackie. We've got Ethel over here. Joe Kennedy returned from his travels to a home with affection. Okay, so we're about to read more about that. Well, the tall, slim Kennedy made friends easily and was one of the most popular boys in his class. He became colonel of the cadet regiment and led it with victory in the citywide drill competition. As a senior, he was elected president of the class. He played basketball, managed the football team, and was captain of the baseball team for 2 years. Few Irishmen could afford to go to college in those days, and most of those who did went to the Jesuits of Boston College or Holy Cross. Though Patrick and Mary Kennedy were devout Catholics, they wanted something for their son that the Jesuits could not provide. Let the church frown and let the neighbors gossip, Joe would enroll at Harvard. Kennedy, by his own later account, did all right at Harvard. His main interest, at Boston Latin, was making the grades socially. Unlike others in the Irish minority who commuted to Cambridge and took little part in college life, Kennedy lived in the Harvard yard and made it a point to seek out and cultivate the leading undergraduates. He was, of course, ineligible for the best clubs, but then so were all but a relative handful of his classmates, those who had attended the right Episcopal prep schools. He was elected to Hasty Pudding, which I guess is a club, and had the distinction of being Dickie, that is, one of the first 45 sophomores chosen. His final club was DU, which he made unfashionably late in his senior year. I'm sure insiders would know what any of that means, but it doesn't mean anything to me. If you understand it, please let me know in the comments. Reasonably successful in his social ambitions, he faced a seemingly impassable obstacle to his romantic ambitions. While at Boston Latin School, he had dated dark-haired, vivacious Rose Fitzgerald, who attended Dorchester High and was voted Boston's prettiest high school senior by her classmates. They had met as children when John F. Fitzgerald, the irrepressible Honey Fitz, he had been the Boston mayor, had brought his daughter along on his visits to the Kennedy home in East Boston. The friendship between Pat Kennedy and Honey Fitz, the boss of the North End, was motivated by political rather than social considerations. Fitzgerald disapproved of his daughter's slowly blossoming romance with young Kennedy. His distaste for the idea of having him as a son-in-law was explained by the rising prestige of the Fitzgeralds in the Irish community. In the mayoralty, we would call that the mayoral contest of 1910, Fitzgerald had defeated James Jackson Storrow, a Yankee millionaire investment banker, and had gained new stature. Emerging from Harvard in June 1912, Joe Kennedy entered a provincial Boston, an awesomely self-satisfied city, hardened in a mold the first families found perfect and meant to preserve against all change. The leading profession in this city of trust was banking, and Kennedy decided to make it his career. Using the influence of his father and others to hasten his appointment, he became a state bank examiner. The salary was unattractive, $1,500 a year, and the hours were long, but the year and a half he spent poring over other people's ledgers was richly rewarding. In the fall of 1913, Kennedy's apprenticeship in banking ended abruptly when a wave of bank mergers threatened to engulf his family's interests in the Columbia Trust Company in East Boston. At his father's urging, Kennedy rallied proxies and borrowed heavily to buy additional stock to retain control of the bank. The counterattack succeeded, and Kennedy, at 25, had himself elected president of Columbia Trust. Okay, I had heard that he had made his money through banking, but this explains a lot of it, that he had, through grit, basically retained hold of a bank and then gotten elected its president. Although the bank was small, newspapers immediately hailed him as the youngest bank president in the country. His title was impressive. As Kennedy had hoped, Mayor Fitzgerald was dazzled. A bank president, and the youngest one at that, was eminently eligible suitor for his daughter. Not long after the engagement of Rose Fitzgerald, the belle of Irish Boston, and Joseph Patrick Kennedy was announced. They were married in October 1914 at a nuptial mass celebrated by William Cardinal O'Connell. 2 weeks later, they moved into a gray frame house on Beale Street in a middle-class neighborhood in Brookline. The house had cost $6,500, and the bridegroom, already deep in debt as the result of buying Columbia Trust stock, went $2,000 deeper to make the down payment. Within a year, the first Kennedy child, Joe Jr., would be born. Success, formerly just a matter of pride with Kennedy, was now a matter of urgent necessity. Kennedy remained at Columbia Trust Company and engaged in modest real estate speculation as a sideline until early in 1917, when he went to nearby Quincy to become an assistant general manager of Bethlehem Steel's booming Four River shipyard. Under the spur of wartime urgency, he supervised a workforce of 22,000 and earned what was then big money, $20,000 a year, plus handsome bonuses. With the collapse of shipbuilding at the end of the war, he nimbly moved into the stock market as office manager of the Boston-based brokerage firm of Hayden, Stone and Company. Although he suffered some early reverses in the market, he soon was making swift progress toward his goal of becoming a millionaire by the time he was 35. The Kennedys soon were sufficiently prosperous and numerous to have outgrown the house on Beale Street. Before Joe Jr. was 2 years old, John Fitzgerald was born on May 29th, 1917. So if he had lived, he would be 107 now. In September of the next year, Rosemary arrived, and in 1920, Kathleen was born. The Kennedys moved into a 12-room house on Naples Road in a more fashionable section of Brookline. In July 1921, Eunice arrived. Fortunately, Rose did not have to cope with her growing family single-handedly. In addition to domestic servants, she had a nurse and a governess to care for the children. Joe, in his infrequent free moments, willingly pushed a baby carriage. I don't know about that. In Ask Not, the book that we read about the Kennedys, we were told by that author that between the births of Rosemary and Kathleen that Rose actually left all of the children and went home to her father, Honey Fitz, and tried to stay home. And after a few days, he told her, "What are you doing here? Go back to your house." And she basically said she was overwhelmed. And he said, "Tell Joe what you need. Tell him that you need some help, and specify which kinds of help so that he can do that. You have money enough. Like, do what you have to make your life livable." So now they're in a more fashionable house. She has help. And apparently Joe is occasionally pushing the baby carriage. I kind of doubt it, but maybe. There's no photo evidence, I'll point out. Kennedy pursued wealth single-mindedly, but never as an end in itself. He made money as a means of uplifting his family. The Kennedy household centered on the mother. She was devoted, conscientious. Said a friend, she would leave any party early to be home in time for a baby's feeding. She kept a card index on the children, recording when each child had measles and mumps, one side or both, whether their vaccinations took, the results of each physical examination, and visits to the dentist. On pleasant days, Rose has said, I took the children for walks. I wheeled one in a baby carriage, and 2 or 3 toddled along with me. I made it a point each day to take them into church for a visit. I wanted them to form a habit of making God and religion a part of their daily lives, not something to be reserved for Sundays. Rose favored direct, old-fashioned discipline. I used to have a ruler around and paddled them occasionally because when they're young, that's all they understand. While Rose saw to the children's catechism and paddling, Joe enforced a different kind of discipline, strongly reminiscent of his father's. The new Brookline neighborhood of large tree-shaded residents was distinctly Yankee and Protestant, but the Kennedys were determined not to be outsiders. When the boys were old enough, they were enrolled at the Dexter School, 6 blocks away, where they may have been the only Catholic students. If Joe and Jack were without Irish neighbors and schoolmates, they always had grandfather Honey Fitz, who was no longer mayor but had scarcely retired from politics. A frequent visitor, he took the boys to ride on the swan boats in the public garden or to the zoo at Franklin Park or to see the Red Sox play. That would be fun as a young man to have somebody with money enough and connections enough to get you into the games of whatever city you lived in. That would be really fun. In 1922, Kennedy, then 34, decided to strike out on his own. He left the brokerage firm of Hayden Stone and plunged into the speculative melee in Wall Street as a lone wolf speculator. An investment in a chain of New England theaters led to his first major maneuver in the young but rapidly growing movie industry. Interesting. In 1926, he headed a syndicate of New England businessmen who bought a faltering British-owned movie company, Film Booking Office of America, also known as FBO, which included among its roster of stars Red Grange, Fred Thompson, and Tom Mix. Deeply committed in the stock market and the movies, Kennedy found Boston remote from his scene of operations. He also found its leading citizens stubbornly reluctant to recognize the rising millionaire in their midst as anyone but the son-in-law of Honey Fitz. The Kennedys, Joe believed, had earned recognition as something more than moneyed Irish. In the leading Yankee families, the Kennedy wealth was intended to serve as the foundation of a secure social position. A trust fund, the first of 3, was established with Rose as trustee. Each of the 7 youngsters, including the infants Patricia, born in 1924, and Robert, born the following year, shared equally and would receive an income at the age of 21. At the age of 45, each child would receive a share of 1/2 the principal of the trust fund. Eventually, additions to this fund and the creation of 2 others in 1936 and 1949 would earmark upward of $10 million for each of the Kennedys' children. With the creation of the trust funds, Kennedy boasted to a friend, I fixed it so that any of my children, financially speaking, could look me in the eye and tell me to go to hell. But what good was money if it could not be translated into social prestige? In the spring of 1926, Kennedy packed his family and servants aboard a private railroad car and left Boston in grandly defiant style, bound for a new home in Riverdale, a pleasant residential section of the Bronx. Boston was no place to bring up Catholic children, Kennedy later declared. Perhaps not, but neither was it a promising place to pursue his vaulting financial ambitions. This city was a small, clear puddle, said a Boston banker. New York was a big, muddy one, and that's what Joe wanted. Kennedy's whirlwind movie career lasted only 32 months, but he scrambled to the top of 3 larger companies and engineered the merger that created the giant Radio Keith Orpheum in October 1928. He would emerge from Hollywood at least 30 pounds underweight and perhaps $5 million richer. In Hollywood, Kennedy's working day was seldom less than 14 hours, but the drive for wealth and position did not exhaust his restless energy. Somehow he made time in his busy round for a demanding sideline, guiding the fortunes of the glamorous Gloria Swanson. I heard that they had a tryst. When he first met her, he fell instantly under her spell. The queen of the films exerted an attraction that went beyond commonplace physical beauty. There were more beautiful women in the movies, but none possessed her silken grace and regal self-assurance. Adored by so many, she was accessible only to a select few. Dazzling and drawn by this radiant presence, Kennedy won entry to her circle, becoming banker, advisor, and close friend. And more, is my understanding. They were seen together frequently at parties and dinners in New York and California, their mutual admiration apparent to everyone. The end of Kennedy's relationship with Miss Swanson was abrupt. I questioned his judgment, she recalled. He did not like to be questioned. Off on prolonged trips to California, where he lived in a large rented house in Beverly Hills, he went weeks at a stretch without seeing Rose and the children, who were now numbering 8. Even the chore of house hunting for the perennially moving Kennedys fell to his aide of all work, Eddie Moore, who was dispatched to scout suburban Westchester. A real estate agent listened patiently as Moore outlined the needs and desires of the Kennedys. Hell, he said, reaching into his files for another stack of floor plans. Kennedy can't use a residence. He wants a hotel. At length, something suitable was found, and the family moved into an imposing brick Georgian mansion in Bronxville, surrounded by 5 acres of clipped lawns and gardens. This small estate, which cost close to $250,000, offered not only elegance, but elbow room for the children. In the afternoon, Joe Jr. and Jack brought friends from the Riverdale School, which they still attended as day students, to play baseball and football on the broad lawns. Sometimes a few schoolmates were invited to stay for a special treat. The latest movies in the Kennedy's basement projection room. Joe himself established a personal PTA, occasionally inviting his son's teachers to the house for a chat and a movie show when he happened to be at home. I wonder what all was going on in those. Well, here we have an advertisement. You guys know I love to share these when they're there. So this says, today have a soup that's new to you from Campbell. And there's all sorts of soups, from split pea with ham, chicken, vegetable, onion soup, vegetable bean, New England clam chowder. All sorts of options available to you from Campbell's. There is a tar guard filter for cigarettes. You can't clean your lungs the way you clean your tar guard. So this was supposedly to keep your lungs from inhaling the tar, I suppose. Tar guard, your cigarette filter. There's a photo that will make sense more later. This says, when he was an ambassador, as U.S. ambassador in London, Kennedy was a social success, but a political embarrassment. Here he inspects bomb damage during the London Blitz. So I suppose going through a place that was closed off to visitors, he was going in to inspect. It says, the reports he heard in the evenings were generally good. Joe Jr. was bright and willing. Jack, who did well in history, would one day learn to spell. Life without father threw heavy responsibility on Rose. Quietly strong and self-sufficient, she bore up well. Joe's influence on the children grew as they grew older. In the early years, Rose was the vivid, immediate presence in their lives. A friend detected her all-pervasive influence even in the inflection of their voices. When Jack spoke, I could hear his mother's voice. Said this friend simply, she's the one who put the family's spirit in them. In her son Jack's eyes, Rose was the glue that held the Kennedys together. Although a nurse and a governess helped her with the smaller children, Rose took her meals with the youngsters, read to them by the hour, led shopping and sightseeing excursions, and faithfully heard their nightly prayers and their catechism lessons every Friday afternoon. Comforter and confidant, she was also the disciplinarian. Hot water was my department, said Rose. Business was Joe's department. What her husband's business was, Rose could not have said. Not until almost 2 years after he acquired the Film Booking Office of America did Rose discover her husband was in the movie business, and she was never clear which companies he was connected with. The strictest taboo forbade discussion of money at the dinner table. In Joe's view, there was no need for such talk. There was enough money, and that was all that mattered. Still, as a matter of discipline, Rose kept the children's allowances small. Jack chafed under such character-building restriction and addressed a solemn appeal to his father. "My recent allowance is 40 cents, he wrote. "This I used for aeroplanes and other playthings of childhood. But now I am a scout, and I put away my childish things." That's a reference to a Bible verse that when you become a man, you put away childish things. "Before I would spend 20 cents of my 40 cents allowance, and in 5 minutes I would have empty pockets and nothing to gain and 20 cents to lose. When I am a scout, I have to buy canteens, haversacks, blankets, searchlights, poncho things that will last for years, and I can always use it while I can't use chocolate marshmallow sundae ice cream. And so I put in my plea for a raise of 30 cents for me to buy such things." Lots of misspellings here that they included in the printing. "To buy such things and pay my own way around." There is no record that this pay-as-I-go proposal moved Joe to interfere in his wife's department. For young Jack, empty pockets was only one concern. An ever-present and formidable problem was his domineering older brother. Rose believed firmly in raising the first child well and setting him up as a model for the others. Joe Jr. early assumed a major role in the upbringing of his brothers and sisters. He was patient and gentle with the small ones, a good athlete who became their hero as he taught them to throw a ball, ride a bicycle, and sail a boat. But with the slight, willowy Jack, the only rival for his throne, he was a severe taskmaster and a taunting bully. They fought frequently, the younger children cowering in terror upstairs as their brothers wrestled on the first floor. The fights usually ended with Jack pinned and humiliated. Joe Kennedy was aware of these one-sided contests, but he did nothing. He said he would not step between the boys when they fought, so long as they fought together against outsiders. Much moved in these years, the Kennedys did not set down real roots until 1928, when Joe bought a rambling white frame house in the Cape Cod village of Hyannisport. The spacious house contained 15 rooms and 9 baths and proved easy to live in. That first year, Kennedy was too busy elsewhere to enjoy his new home, but thereafter it became his special domain, the place where family, rather than business, preoccupied him. During days filled with ceaseless activity, he shaped his children. Long before the much-publicized mass gambles on the playing fields of Hyannis, the 4th of July softball games, and the bruising touch football scrimmages, he thrust each child into individual sports such as swimming and sailing, believing these would best develop initiative and self-reliance. Firmly, he implanted his conviction that playing the game was not as important as winning. Obediently, Jack named his first sailboat Victoria, explaining years later that it was a Latin word meaning something about winning. "Even when we were 6 and 7 years old," Eunice recalled, "Daddy always entered us in the public swimming races. The thing he always kept telling us was that coming in second was just no good. The important thing was to win. Don't come in second or third. That doesn't count, but win, win, win." Winning as a way of life was, of course, an illusion. No one knew this better than Joe Kennedy. His eldest daughter, Rosemary, a sweet, attractive girl who resembled her mother, could not compete with her aggressive brothers and sisters. Shouts of "win, win, win" could not change what was tragically unalterable. This is going to be interesting to read how they talked about this at this time. Let's pay attention, because to my knowledge, I've not read anything that was written contemporaneously about Rosemary. So to read something written in 1964 is fascinating. She had been slower to crawl, slower to walk, and speak. She's the sister who, you remember, ended up having a lobotomy. In her early 20s, she underwent a lobotomy with Joe's decision and was never the same and was institutionalized for the rest of her life. So let's see what they say about it. She had been slower to crawl, slower to walk, and speak than her two brothers. Concerned, Rose had taken her to several doctors, all of whom were at first reassuring. Rosemary would soon catch up. But the truth soon wounded her parents in a way only a helpless mother and father can be hurt. Rosemary was mentally retarded. To the suggestion that she be sent away to an institution, Joe reacted with fierce loyalty. What can they do for her that her family can't do better? We will keep her at home. And so Rosemary stayed with the family. At Hyannisport, she was taken as crew in the sailboat races and glowed with happiness when she was in the winning boat. She sat entranced as Rose played the piano and sang to her in the evening. At the table, she could not manage a knife, so her meat was served already cut. Everything that love could do was done for Rosemary, yet nothing helped. Joe Kennedy spoke proudly of his children to casual acquaintances, yet even good friends of the family did not know about Rosemary. Over the years, the family devised all manner of stories and excuses to conceal her condition. When Kennedy finally disclosed the truth to a reporter in 1960, it was with a pathetic air of apology. I used to think it was something to hide, something not to talk about. But then I learned that almost everyone I know has a relative or good friend who has a problem of a mentally retarded child somewhere in the family. You have no idea how widespread it is. I've worn more hats and neckties betting people that they have a problem somewhere among their relatives or good friends. Well, his joking and betting aside, of course, his decision in Rosemary's life ruined her life, and it ruined the glow that she had. I don't doubt that there were problems that they faced as a family, and my understanding is she even would get violent sometimes. But it's interesting the way that he started out. What can they do better for her that her family can't do better? We will keep her at home. That was actually when we did the review of the chapter on Rosemary in Maureen Callahan's book, Ask Not. That was the conclusion that I came to, that I wish a family with such resources and opportunities around the nation and around the globe couldn't have found her just one-on-one care, maybe in a cottage somewhere where she wouldn't have had to undergo this medical experimentation that was really butchery. So this attitude that he started with, he didn't keep. And later, the medical experimentation she underwent changed her life. Well, that is the beginning of the Kennedy family. I hope you've enjoyed this look I have at how Joe Kennedy, the kind of the origin story of him, where he came from, kind of scrapping it out of an Irish Catholic background, making his way through Boston society, earning funds through really smart bank deals and perhaps sketchy things as well. And also I didn't understand about his Hollywood years, but this gave us a little bit more of a look at that. So that is our look at this. The cover is torn, but you can see the headline there. Beginning, an intimate biography, Joseph P. Kennedy, how he raised his children to govern America. So that is our look at that article. I hope you enjoyed it. Come back next time for part 2. We'll see you then. Bye.